Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our author series with Benjamin Radford. Benjamin Radford is an American writer, investigator, and skeptic. He is deputy editor of Skeptical Inquirer Science magazine and a research fellow with the nonprofit educational organization, the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. Radford has appeared on the National Geographic Channel, the Discovery Channel, the History Channel, Good Morning America, the Learning Channel, CBC, BBC, and CNN. Radford is one of the world's few science-based paranormal investigators and has done firsthand research into mysterious phenomena in 16 countries on 4 continents, including physics, ghosts and haunted houses, exorcisms, miracles, Bigfoot, stigmata, lake monsters, UFO sightings, reincarnation, and crop circles, and many, many other topics. He's perhaps best known for solving the mysteries of the Santa Fe courthouse ghost in 2007 and the Hispanic vampire El Chupacabra in 2010. He received a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of New Mexico and a master's in education from the University of Buffalo. He's a member of the American Folklore Society, the British Columbia Scientific Cryptozoology Club, and the American College of Forensic Examiners International. He's written over 1,000 articles on a wide variety of topics, including urban legends, the paranormal, critical thinking, and media literacy. But he's also a board game creator, puzzle designer, film director, and co-founder of 2 podcasts, Monster Talk and Squaring the Strange. Now, Squaring the Strange, if you haven't heard this podcast, it's a show that uses critical thinking and evidence-based analysis to examine the world around us. And who couldn't use more critical thinking in today's world? Well, please join me in welcoming Ben as we discuss his books, and in particular, Investigating Ghosts, which is based on nearly 20 years of firsthand science-based investigations and research. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. This is cool to be here. There's ever since the pandemic and everything, it's been sort of weird trying to navigate the new world of trying to make sure that I'm giving talks and letting people see where I am and what's going on. So if I could ask everybody to mute your microphones so that the or I guess either I could do that or someone else could do that. But if everybody just does it on their end, that'll make life easier for everybody. So I'll just begin by telling you the structure for this is going to be that I'm going to talk for the first half on ghost investigations in general. And then the second half, I'm going to go into a case study that I'm especially known for right here in Albuquerque. So it'll be fun to sort of go from the broad scope and then zoom into the narrow one. Sandra did an excellent job of summarizing my background. And when I hear people say it back to me, it sounds very very odd and sort of like, oh, board games and this and that. But sure enough, all that's true. One of the things that distinguishes my approach to ghosts and ghost investigation, as she mentioned, is that I try and bring a critical thinking perspective to it. And so I try to bring critical thinking and science and scientific methodologies. And occasionally I'll hear people say that they'll suggest that somehow ghosts are beyond science. And I'm not even sure what that would even mean. Everything in the world around us can be examined through a scientific lens. Botany, zoology, physics, everything around us is amenable to investigation through scientific means. And that includes ghosts, that includes Bigfoot, that includes crop circles, it includes psychic powers and all these other things. And so that's really my specialty and my interest is in focusing on how we can bring critical thinking in the scientific process to bear on these so-called unexplained mysteries, and oftentimes they are explained. As she mentioned, I've written, I think, a dozen books or so, probably best known for tracking Chupacabra. I did a book on evil clowns. So I was notable for that. As some of you may remember, the scary clown panic in 2016, when there were actually clown lockdowns. There were schools that were locked down because of threats from clowns. Suddenly I was the media darling, having to explain scary clowns for that. But probably I'm other than that, I'm probably best known for, and reason I'm talking tonight is my book Investigating Ghosts, and that's sort of what I'll be focusing on here. So I want to talk some about the history of ghost investigation, because oftentimes when you hear ghost hunters, they sort of talk like it was invented last week, or when Ghost Adventures or Ghost Hunters, the TV show, came on the air. But in fact, ghost hunting in some form has been around for over a century, in fact, even longer. For most of human history, when people talked about communicating with spirits and the dead, they weren't referring to somebody going to a location, a ghost hunter, for example, with equipment and trying to do what's called provocation, trying to get a ghost to, usually a reticent and sometimes recalcitrant ghost. Ghosts are not known for being very friendly or amenable to investigation, shall we say. So for most of human history, people believed in ghosts. In fact, ghosts are among the most common paranormal beliefs all around the world. Not every culture has beliefs in other things. Crop circles, Bigfoot, there are different versions of that around the world, but belief in ghosts is widespread. And part of that is because it's part of a constellation of beliefs. So people who believe in ghosts also believe in the afterlife. They believe in near-death experience. They believe in reincarnation. There's a cluster of psychological beliefs that are all interrelated, and ghosts are part of that. And so for most of human history, when people talked about ghosts, and certainly talking and trying to communicate with ghosts, it was somebody they knew. It was their ancestors. It was their grandmother. It was their friend who'd recently passed. And so there was a personal connection to the ghost and to the spirit they were trying to contact. And so the modern version that you see on TV of ghost hunting would be completely foreign to the version of ghost hunters that existed hundreds of years ago, because they'd say, well, why would you go to some other location you've never been to and talk to the spirit of somebody you've never met? Like, why would they even want to talk to you? Like, I'm a ghost hunter from Boston, tell me about yourself. Screw you, dude, I don't know you. Like, why the premise as to why ghosts would actually want to communicate with ordinary ghost hunters or ghost hunting groups is sort of beyond me. But in fact, again, the history of trying to communicate with the dead, it actually, in terms of trying to find a sort of empirical basis for ghost beliefs, right? So for millennia, people believed in ghosts, but they didn't necessarily believe there was a way to prove the ghost existed. It was just sort of, it was beyond, it was just sort of, it was a feeling, it was a spiritual connection, it was these sorts of things. And the idea that you could actually prove that ghosts exist or gather empirical evidence about them is a very new phenomenon. It's really only been around for a few decades. And the first time that there began people who were trying to systematically detect ghosts and to try and research them and understand their nature was really in the 1870s. And you had the rise of groups such as the Society for Psychical Research, which is actually still in existence today in London, England. It was one of a handful of societies around that time, primarily in London and some here in the States, that had an interest in trying to prove that ghosts existed. And this in turn was inspired in large part by the spiritualist movement here in America. And this began, I'm not going to go into the whole thing because it's kind of complicated. It's a fascinating story, but it's not too relevant here, except insofar as it was created by two girls called the Fox Sisters, and they began in Hydesville, New York, and I've been to where the spiritualism started. And it was these two young sisters, two teenagers, and they claimed that they were in communication with a murdered peddler. And they claimed that the spirit of this dead peddler would communicate with them through raps and knocks. So it'd be like, so almost a sort of 1860s, 1870s version of telegraphs. And through this method, they claimed to have this peddler who had been going door to door, who claimed he had been murdered. They told his story. And this launched what was at the time, it would eventually become one of the primary religions, one of the main religions in America. At one point, spiritualists were all over the place. It was rivaling Christianity and Judaism on the East Coast. These days, there are a few enclaves. There's a place in, I think it's Camp Chesterfield in Florida. There's a place in New York called Lilydale, which is those are the main two spiritualist camps. I've been to Lilydale, and it's a fascinating case. But anyway, so my point is that for many decades, spiritualism was telling people that ghosts not only exist, but they can communicate with us through raps and knocks and things like that. And this inspired people, including Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who of course wrote Sherlock Holmes, and he vouched for the Cottingley fairies hoax. If you know about the story of the young girls in Cottingley, England, who photographed fairies and claimed they were real, it turned out to be a hoax, of course. And Conan Doyle was suckered, and he wasn't too happy about that. But this really launched the assumption or belief that ghosts could be proven to exist, not just communicated with in your dreams and things like that. Ironically, in the later years, the Fox sisters admitted they'd made it up. They admitted that there wasn't a murdered peddler, and they had actually created the knocks and raps through cracking their toes and sort of doing things, with their hands hidden, things like that. And many other spiritualists at the time adopted some of those techniques. So this is why, for example, early skeptics such as Harry Houdini, of course, he's best known for being an illusionist and escape artist, but he was actually a skeptical investigator, and he would investigate mediums at the time, including Marjorie Crandon and others who were claiming to produce things. They would create ectoplasm. They would go into trances and communicate with the dead. And they always had to do this in sort of controlled circumstances. So they would say, okay, well, everybody hold hands, and don't let go. And they'll turn off the lights, and there were different types. Sometimes there would be a trumpet that would sound. And so there were all sorts of different ways that these mediums were basically fake ghosts. And right around this time in the 1840s, a Boston photographer named William Mumler was creating the first ghost photographs. This was shortly after the invention of photography, of course. So these days, if you pull up Google and type in ghost photograph, you'll see all sorts of things, ranging from little orbs to semi-transparent people, things like that. But the very first ghost photographs, or the photographs that were claimed to be of ghosts, again, were created by William Mumler in the 1860s in Boston. And the way he did it was, they were using glass plate photography. And he realized that if you didn't clear, so basically the image would be put onto a glass plate, and so they would recycle them over and over again. And if you in between each photograph, you had to fully clean off the glass, because otherwise the image would still be on there. And he noticed that in some of his photographs, there seemed to be these transparent figures in the background that looked very ghostly. It was very much what you would imagine a ghost photograph in the 1800s would look like. And it turned out, of course, it was actually he hadn't fully cleaned the plate off. So the image was still on the glass plate, and he said, "Hey, I have an idea. We'll call this ghost photographs, and people will come to him." And he made a huge living. He got rich selling ghost photographs, allegedly of ghosts, that were in fact of living people as ghosts. And in fact, he got caught because one of the people that appeared as a ghost in his photographs was recognized on the street. They're like, "Hey, I thought you were dead. Why did you think that?" "Well, I got a ghost photograph that looks like you in the back." Anyway, Mumler, there's a whole trial, is a big story. Anyway, the point here is that there's a whole history of these sorts of things, and oftentimes the history of ghost evidence is itself the history of fraud and hoaxing. That's not to say that all ghost photographs and all ghost evidence are hoax, because much of it isn't. It's not necessarily actually ghosts, but it's things that are misunderstood. But it's important to recognize that the first well-known communications with ghosts was later revealed to be a hoax by the Fox sisters. The first ghost photographs were later revealed to be hoaxes by William Mumler and so on. So fast forward to the 1920s, you had different investigators who would come up with these investigations and try and prove that ghosts existed. You had the launch of what was called EVP, electronic voice phenomena. And this is allegedly where you have people who, typically ghost hunters, who are trying to capture what they think are ghostly voices in allegedly haunted places, in cemeteries and what have you. And there's a whole tradition of that. But it wasn't really until maybe 20 years or so ago, with the rise of TV shows such as Ghost Hunters, and later all its spin-offs, Ghost Adventures, and so on, that ghost hunting really went into the mainstream. And part of the reason is that the premise of these TV shows is that anybody can do this, right? Because the original Ghost Hunters TV show titled Ghost Hunters, which I think had 10 seasons of not finding ghosts, in the same way that the TV show Finding Bigfoot, still not finding Bigfoot. It's weird how that works. But anyway, the premise of the show, the reason these shows are so popular, is that for those who haven't seen it, first of all, you're lucky. Second of all, the premise is you have these two plumbers, these two Roto-Rooter guys, and we're just average Joes, man. We're not those pointy eggheads. We don't got no degrees. No, but you know what? We have interesting ghosts, and we're going to go in places and use beepy things and gadgets and look for ghosts. And this is very appealing, of course, to audiences, because they're saying you don't need training to look for ghosts. You don't even really need equipment. You just need an interesting ghost. You need to have the time and interest in going around. And if you take enough photographs, if you have enough audio recorders, that eventually you'll come up with something that might be ghostly evidence. And so there was this sort of democratization of investigation. And the results of that is that despite the popularity of ghost hunting groups, and inspired in many cases by TV shows, not just America, but around the world. I mean, there's literally thousands of ghost investigators and paranormal investigators, and I've met many of them, not thousands. Thankfully, I've met many of them, and interviews them for some of my books, and had generally productive conversation with them. And when you talk to these people, for the most part, they're sincere. Right, they're most of the ghost hunters that I have spoken to, they're intelligent people, they're interesting, they're fun to be around, within reason. I mean, they're a little weird, but that's to be expected. We're talking ghosts here, but they're generally trying to find ghosts. And what I try to bring to the table, both when I talk to them in ghost hunting and when I go on TV shows, as I come on as for lack of a better word, the skeptic. And the skeptic doesn't mean that I'm saying ghosts don't exist, this is all ridiculous, everybody go home. All that means is that I'm asking for evidence. If you want me to believe that a photograph is of a ghost, then give me some reason to believe that. If you want me to believe that that there's some evil entity in your garage that's making things fly around, you might be right. I don't know, but you have to give me evidence. You have to give me something to go on. And so this sort of leads me to one of the main problems of modern ghost hunting, for example, as it's done on TV, and which again in turn inspires a lot of the amateur groups, which is that they're doing what's called anomaly hunting. They're looking for anything weird and saying that anything weird must be a ghost. And the problem is that part of the problem is there's a wide variety of things that can be interpreted as ghostly phenomena. And this is where there's this interesting gulf between how ghosts are depicted in TV and in films and horror films, for example, the Conjuring films and The Exorcist and Amityville, things like that. So obviously on TV, it's very dramatic, and there's, things flying around, there's poltergeist activity and things are exploding and demons are popping out of closets and things like that. In the real world, when you talk to ordinary average people who experience ghosts, they report nothing like that. They report mundane things. They report that a ghostly phenomena would be having a strange smell, or missing keys, or a cat acting funny. And I have a cat. They act funny. That's kind of what they do. I mean, so that's not a good criteria there. Or just ordinary things like that. And so, and again, in contrast with the scary, hyped up, sensationalized, dramatized, of course, depictions in cinema and on TV, oftentimes ghosts are not scary at all to the experiencers. They're comforting. I've talked to many people who talk, yeah, there's a ghost in my house, and yeah, I call her Jane, and she's nice, and you know, I know that she's there because I get a warm feeling, or sometimes she plays little tricks on me, like, you know, I'll turn off the oven and she'll turn it back on, which frankly is a bit dangerous. Or she'll, missing keys, little objects are moved. I know I put that there and I found it later there. Oh, Jane, you're playing with me. These sorts of things. And so for many people, ghosts aren't scary at all. And again, this is another example of the gulf between what's often depicted. And so you have, in pop culture, you would have Casper, or you would have this little spooky, right? So now this is a Victorian era ghost here. Because, for example, notice the chains, right? And so one thing that you find is that the image of what ghosts are changes according to culture and time. So, for example, if you talk to a person living in London in the 1850s, you said, "Do you believe in ghosts?" And they said yes, and then they said, "Well, what is your experience of a ghost?" Most likely, they would say that they were going by some street or some basement, and they heard clanking chains at night. And to Londoners, again, in the 1800s, that was a ghost. It was something dark and scary and dank, because, of course, London, and they had rattling chains and sort of scary clanking in the darkness type thing. So their idea of what a ghost is very different than what the modern ideas of what ghosts are. And the fact that that ghosts are so culture bound and culture defined is really important to recognize, because that's where we bring in anthropology. That's where we bring in folklore. That's where we see that there's all sorts of different ways to approach ghosts. And as Sandra mentioned, I do folklore. I'm a folklorist. I'm a member of the American Folklore Society. And we talk about ghosts there all the time. I mean, it's as ghost lore. And what you find is that among most ghost hunting groups, again, on TV, and if you go to your local ghost hunting group, oftentimes they don't recognize the folkloric aspects of what they're doing. They're often doing what's called legend tripping. And legend tripping, to folklorists, it's basically where there's a pre-existing legend or narrative and they act it out. So, for example, a ghost hunting group or a ghost hunter will say, "Oh, well, on these train tracks, on full moon nights, if you go here during a certain time, you can see a ghost train." And there actually was a case several years back where there was a guy that he was actually killed. It was a ghost hunter who was killed. I think it was in Kentucky or Tennessee, waiting for a ghost train to come across some raised tracks. Unfortunately, a real train came along and he was killed. So there can be sort of the darker side to the ghost hunting, but basically, usually it's again it's a form of what's called legend tripping. And maybe a more familiar version of legend tripping might be Bloody Mary, right? Anybody remember done the Bloody Mary thing? I'm sure a couple of you have. Okay, so the Bloody Mary, it's where it's a ritual usually done by teenage girls, sometimes boys, and this is where you would go in front of a mirror in a bathroom and turn off the lights, and sometimes you have a sink full of water, and sometimes you light a candle, and you say Bloody Mary, and you call Bloody Mary 3 times, 10 times, 100 times until you get bored, whatever it is. And if you do it the right number of times, which varies from place to place and story to story, then Bloody Mary will appear in the mirror. And, well, we don't really know what happens, right? Because there's different versions of it. So according to some people, Bloody Mary comes out of the mirror and grabs you. And if you think about it, it's like, if you really think that's going to happen, why would you do that? like, oh yeah, I hope a scary ass ghost comes out and grabs me, right? I mean, this is not something you would want, right? In other versions of the Bloody Mary story, you have Bloody Mary actually shows you what you'll look like when you're older. And sometimes Bloody Mary will appear, you'll see your own image, but then she'll appear behind you in the mirror in true horror film fashion. So again, there's lots of different versions of this, but my point here is that they're doing what's called they're doing well, there's actually two names for it. One is legend tripping. Another version of it is called ostension, and again, that's where you sort of act out stories and plays and stuff. So anyway, so I'm gonna try and save some time toward the end here to sort of go over go into a specific case, but I've investigated haunted houses really around the world, in Jamaica, in Canada, across the country, and there's all sorts of types of evidence offered for it. There's, again, I mentioned EVPs before. There's ghostly photographs. There are what are called orbs, which are sort of little white light reflections. Oftentimes, we know exactly what they are. They're flash reflections and so on. So I could do a whole 2-hour talk just on ghost evidence alone. And if people are interested, again, you can check out my book, Investigating Ghosts, which won a book award. I'm not too proud to say that. And let me just end this part of the talk by, and I'll leave time for Q&A. So if I'm leaving something out or I'm not addressing some burning question, then we can circle back to it. But I want to point out one part of ghost lore and ghost investigation that's often overlooked, and that is that even the so-called ghost experts themselves can't agree on what they are. And it took me a while to realize that it was very odd, because when I was researching my book and looking into it again from a folkloric perspective, I had kind of assumed, well, everybody knows what ghosts are, right? I mean, ghosts, they're spirits of the dead. But if you actually talk to ghost investigators and talk to so-called experts, and if you look at the folklore, there's actually a wide variety of claims about what ghosts are, and many of them are mutually exclusive. So, for example, many people believe that ghosts are the spirits of the dead that can't cross over. That is, they're sort of in this sort of almost Christian theological version of purgatory, where they died and they can't get over to the other side. Usually they're victims of some sort of malice, right? They've been murdered, they were done wrong, betrayed, things like that. And this sort of goes into the whole dramatic ghost story. And the idea is that once the ghosts recognize they're dead, or that they need to transition to the other side, then they can go on and pass. And it was interesting. I was doing an investigation in Fort George, Canada, Niagara-on-the-Lake, about 10-12 years ago. And I had a really interesting conversation with a psychic ghost hunter who was there at Fort George with me. And we were doing an investigation for a TV show, and I was, of course, the token skeptic and whatever. We all got along pretty well. But I was talking to her, I said, well, what is your role in this ghost hunt? And again, I wasn't even getting into whether psychic powers are real or not, have been proven to exist. I wasn't even going there. I was just saying, how do you see your role in what we're doing here? And she said that she helps the ghosts move on. And I'd heard that before, but so we had plenty of time. It was like 2 a.m. and it was freezing cold because it was November. I'm not sure whose idea that was, but anyway, in Fort George, it's this old fort that was built forever ago. So this is Ontario. Thanksgiving, who does that anyway? And it was fascinating because she was talking with such pride about how many spirits she had helped to the other side. And she was really proud of it. She's like, yeah, I've done this for I think it was 8 or 10 years. And I've gone to the different places, and I've helped the ghosts and the spirits recognize that they're dead and come to peace with things and help them move on. And it was interesting because it gave me insight into the psychology of some of the ghost hunters, because they felt validated. They felt good. They felt like they were helping people. It's like in the same way that you might get a rush or a pleasant feeling over volunteering at a homeless shelter or giving out food or something. She felt this enormous pride and self-worth from helping these ghosts move along. And it occurred to me that we don't even know if ghosts exist, much less that they're being helped move along. But in so many ghost hunters, their identity is involved in being ghost hunters. And look at this, and I was on this TV show, and look at our website. And they're so invested in proving that ghosts exist and showing off all their ghost photos and things like that. They don't bother to bring the good scientific evidence into it. Anyway, so getting back to the different things. So that's one idea of what ghosts are. Other ghost experts say, no, that's all wrong. No. Ghosts are actually recordings of emotions in the environment. So they say, no, the idea that ghosts are the spirits of the dead who can't cross over, that's totally garbage. That's silly. No. What they are is that when something happened to a person, for example, there was a murder, it's usually something dramatic, of course. I mean, stubbing your toe doesn't create ghosts. Having your credit card declined doesn't create ghosts. It's got to be something that's really sensational and something that Shakespeare would write about. And you especially find this, for example, on battlefields. For example, at Gettysburg, that is one of the main, because Gettysburg is a huge ghost tourism place, much in the same way that Salem is for witches, and in New Orleans for voodoo and other weirdness there. And so when you talk to ghost hunters at Gettysburg, and you can't throw a cat without finding one, they will again, there's different ones have different interpretations, but a common one is that ghosts are the energy that's stored when something scary or violent or emotional happens, and it is the vibrations are absorbed into the environment. And this is what's called stone tape theory. And the idea is that something bad happens in a location. That's why, for example, ghosts might be seen at a sanitarium or on a battlefield. The idea is that some emotional energy is stored and then released, and is seen as ghosts when that energy is released. Other ghost experts are like, no, you don't know what you're talking about. No, ghosts are in projections of our minds into the world. So again, there are several. I'm not going to go into all of them, but the point here is that even ghost experts who have written books can't agree on what ghosts are. This gives you some insight as to why we still don't have good quality evidence, scientific evidence of ghosts. Because if even the experts can't agree on whether a ghost is the spirit of a dead that can't cross over, or it's energy, emotions, that's captured in trees and homes, or something else. Well, how do you prove that? In science, how do you falsify that? How do you prove one theory over another? And the answer is they haven't. And I'll tell you one quick story before I go to the second part here. I was doing a haunted house investigation in Clovis, California. And it was a place called Haunted Wolf Manor. And this actually made it onto a TV show. I think if you do Google search for, I think it's Return of the Amityville Horror. I think it was a Mystery Quest episode, so I'm on there. And it was funny because I got a call from the producer from the TV show. They said, yeah, we heard you do investigations. We want to bring some science to it. We like what you do. And I said, yeah, so we're going to be flying you out to California. And I said, okay, what's the title of the show? She said, well, it's the Amityville Horror, the real Amityville Horror. And I said, Amityville, that's on the East Coast. Why are we flying to California? Like you have the wrong coast. Did you not research this? She's like, oh, we'll fix it in post. I'm like, all right, well, whatever. So so we went there anyway. So long story short, so I was there for I think 3 or 4 days doing investigations for part of a TV show, and it was a big production. And as it began, I had I was sort of the lone sort of science-based, evidence-based empirical skeptic, and then we had a couple psychics, we had an inventor, we had a couple ghost hunting teams. And the main ghost hunting team was a protege of the Warrens, Ed and Lorraine Warren, who are probably best known for being depicted in the Conjuring films. There's a whole on my podcast, Squaring the Strange, we did a whole series on the Warrens that is not very flattering to them. I'll just leave it at that. Anyway, so this one ghost hunter and his group, I showed up on set. And they came in and they rented one of those vans, like it's like super long van, like a van version of a stretch limo. And I'm just showing up. I just met the producer. I'm having a Coke and watching this. And they pull up in this van, and I think there were 4 of them, and they're unloading all this gear, just these huge crates, and like the cameras and EMF detectors, and just they spent 40 minutes unloading this van and setting up cameras, and it was all very dramatic and all very TV friendly. And they had cameras here and there and all sorts of things. And on the second night, as we were wrapping up, I think it was a little bit past midnight, and we were going back to the hotel, and the producer was driving us, and so the cameras were off. No was wrong. Just me, the lead ghost hunter, and the producer, the PA. And I said, we're all tired. It's been a long day shooting, whatever else. And I said, hey, I'm just curious, why do you think, and again, this is between us, we're not on camera. This isn't a gotcha moment. Why do you think that we still don't have good evidence for ghosts? I'm just wondering what's your explanation for that? And he says, well, I think the real problem is that we don't have good enough evidence because they can't be captured with scientific equipment, with the technology we currently have. And I said, well, what were you doing yesterday? Like, I watched you unload a van, and they're bragging, oh, this is like $70,000 equipment. Like, if all that equipment that you spent all this time setting up, all the monitors and cameras and videos, if ghosts can't be captured on this technology, why did you bring that technology? And the producer's like, so it's like, and I was like, and it was weird because nobody had ever asked him that question. He was like, I'm like, well, I'm not trying to be mean to you. I don't understand. You're saying that the reason you don't have better evidence of ghosts is because we can't detect or record them, but you're bringing all this equipment and gear that you claim detects and records them. So which is it? And he's like, rah, rah, I'm tired. So I never got an answer to the question. Although I did actually catch one of the members, not of that team, but another team on that shoot, faking evidence. And I'll save that for another time. Anyway, with that, I've probably gone a little bit over time, but I'm going to switch now, if I can, to giving you a look at a investigation that I did. Let's see if I can pull this up here. And all right, so with a thumbs up, can you see my screen? It probably says something along the lines of Ghosts of New Mexico. Yes, okay, I'm getting a couple thumbs up. Perfect. All right. So those are a couple of my books. And I'm going to my most recent book. So I'm going to talk, these are just a handful of the ghost investigations I've done. I'm going to focus on the haunting of the Chemo Theater. And this is actually one of my better known investigations. It does appear in the book there on the left, Mysterious New Mexico. And so here's a quick version of that story. And I like it because it tells an interesting story. It's one that I personally investigated and frankly solved. And even to this day, it's still talked about. In fact, here in my left hand, I actually have a copy of the Albuquerque Journal from Monday, and it mentions the Chemo Theater. It doesn't mention me, and I'll talk about that in a second. But anyway, so and I know that many of our audience are right here in Albuquerque, so most of us can actually drive there within 20 minutes. But for those who aren't here, this is the Chemo Theater. This is the true story of one of the most haunted theaters in the Southwest. And it's probably the best known theater in New Mexico, if not the entire Southwest. And it's been the subject of dozens of newspaper and magazine articles, book chapters, and TV shows, and even a couple investigations by local ghost hunter groups. So here's the story in a nutshell. So, and again, if you want more details, check out my book, Mysterious New Mexico. I think it's chapter one or two. So the story begins with a tragedy at the Chemo Theater, as of course most ghost stories do. So the theater was successful for its first quarter century, hosting everybody from vaudeville to Hollywood films. But on August 2nd, 1951, there was a tragedy there. About 1,000 people were in the theater to see an Abbott and Costello film when a water heater supplying the concession stand exploded. Now, this is not legend. We know for a fact this has happened. This is documented. Here's a copy of the Albuquerque Journal at the time. And the only victim, the only person that died, well, there were many had injuries, but the only one that died was him there on the right, Bobby Darnell II, Darnell Jr. So this happened in 1951, and several decades later, 20 some years later, Bobby returned, and I'll explain why in a second. So, and this is the basis for the Chemo Theater story, which again is circulating to this day as of as of Monday. So according to Jewel Sanchez, who worked there, and quote, this is the story. So one Christmas day in 1974, there was a performance of some sort, and a member of the crew who was unaware of the donut tradition. You're wondering, hold on, Ben, what's this donut tradition? I'll get to that. Saw a collection of sweets hanging on the water pipe and placed them in the trash. I was told that as soon as they were removed, all sorts of weird and negative stuff began to happen. Now, keep in mind, just to pause here for a second. So oftentimes, you have to give a tip to ghosts, right? Oftentimes, if there's evil creatures or scary things, even fairies, British fairies, oftentimes people would leave something for the ghost, leave something for the spirit, leave something with the fairies as a thank you, like a please don't hurt me type thing. And this happened here. As soon as they were removed, all sorts of weird negative stuff began to happen. Anything that could go wrong did go wrong. Props which had been well anchored to the floor toppled over as if intentionally pushed by invisible hands. Electrical cables blew up in a storm of sparks and flashes. While going through their live performance, the actors tripped and fell over an invisible object. Some actors stated their fall felt as if it was caused by a pair of invisible hands that quickly but firmly pushed them to the floor. Dan Mayfield, a reporter for the Albuquerque Journal, described the consequences. Quote, the entire cast forgot to show up. Stage lights were popping. Once they got there, actors forgot the lines and doors and windows were flying open. Once the donuts were replaced and Bobby was presumably appeased, the incidents miraculously stopped. So let me explain the donuts, because I'm hungry for donuts. It's late at night. I could use a donut right now, but I'm trying to stick to my diet, so I'm not going to. But the donut idea came up where there was, and again, I'll go into this more detail in a second, but the idea was that donuts were being offered to the child ghost to not ruin the performances at this theater. And so if the story is true, he said advisedly, this would be one of the most famous cases of public poltergeist activity in the world. And I say this because, as I mentioned earlier, usually ghostly activity, it's subtle. It's a weird feeling. It's missing keys. It's a scent. It's something like this. But in this case, if the story is true, then we had entire, not just a cast and crew, but entire audience who watched these mysterious things go wrong, right? Lights exploding, things, actors tripping over things in case of hundreds of witnesses. So this is if the story as told is true, it's an amazing case, and it would be one of the best documented poltergeist case in history. So I as I mentioned, I grew up here in New Mexico. I grew up hearing this story on occasion. Again, pretty much every Halloween, somebody brings it up. And finally, somebody said, "Hey, Ben, you investigate ghosts. What about the chemo?" I'm like, yeah, all right. So I went, okay, let me go look at the Chemo Theater. I mean, it's famous. Nobody had actually really solved it, mainly because nobody had really investigated it very well. So I wanted to see if I could tackle this case, because it's a famous case. It has a local angle. I mean, I can literally drive there in 20 minutes and investigate myself. So rather than just rely on third-hand information like on Wikipedia or wherever else, I enlisted a friend of mine, Mike Smith, And we investigated the Chemo Theater to investigate for ourselves. Now, Jewel Sanchez, who I quoted a minute ago, she's long gone, but the current technical manager, Dennis Potter, is still there to this day, and he has almost single-handedly kept the story alive. This is a photograph of me and Dennis taken by an Albuquerque Journal photographer. Actually, I'd forgotten this actually made the local newspaper after I solved this case and published it. And for those who aren't familiar with the theater, that light standing in between us, that's called a ghost light. So make of that what you will. Yeah, there we go. That's my half-assed attempt to scare you. So this intrigued me because I went to go interview. I almost said Harry Potter, Dennis Potter, and he said, yeah, it actually happened. Now, keep in mind that not usually, but oftentimes when I investigate ghost cases and I sort of go beyond just the stories, I find that it falls apart pretty quickly. You know, the person, well, it was a mistake, or well, they admitted it was a hoax, or it wasn't quite that. In this case, I had a live eyewitness who was there at the time. He said, yes, this actually happened. Like, whoa, this case suddenly got much more interesting. So not only did Potter confirm the basic details of the story, but again, he himself was there that night. Quote from him: "It was just before Christmas, and the New Mexico Repertory Theater did a Christmas Carol," he explained. The director Andrew Shea noticed the donuts sprung up against the brick wall in the back of the stage and ordered them removed. Again, the idea was that the donuts would be put up on the back of the stage, and if you put up the donuts, then the ghost of little Bobby wouldn't ruin the performance. The donuts came off the walls and into the garbage. This, according to legend, is the story of what spawned the theater. So again, I had previously gotten what Jewel Sanchez had said had happened. In this case, I got a chance to interview one of the main eyewitnesses, and what would basically become to the main eyewitness, who saw this. And I'm interviewing Dennis, and he's telling me that his first person eyewitness account of this amazing poltergeist activity. This is what he said: about 10 or 15 minutes in the show, weird things started going wrong. People were forgetting their lines, people were tripping and falling on stage, odd pieces of equipment would fall from the ceiling, light bulb exploded, electrical cables came down. Basically anything that could go wrong did go wrong. He says it was just really weird. They almost literally didn't get through the show. There were so many disruptions. And so behind the stage of the Chemo Theater, there is a small shrine to Bobby, and this is what it looked like as of the time that I was there, probably 6 or 8 years ago. And there's a collection of stuff. So there's little trinkets, little gifts, little things like that. Just little tokens. The donuts are gone. As you can imagine, the public health officials are like, no. You can't have donuts, and you're asking for rats. Little Bobby, as much as little kids love donuts, I think he would like a little sticker or something like that. So skip the donuts. So eventually the donut tradition went away. And so I saw the shrine to Bobby. I heard a first person account of this. And again, this was really compelling to me because this is one of the first times when there was a high profile case, and I had a first person eyewitness who was telling me what happened. And he's a credible person. I mean, he's been the technical director for decades there. He's well respected. He has no reason to make it up. And so at that point, Mike and I were trying to figure out, okay, what is the truth behind this? How did this happen? And so again, not only was Dennis there, but the cast was there, the crew was there, and audiences were there. So this was seen. I mean, I just spoke to Dennis, but presumably there would have been dozens or hundreds of people who would have told the same story, maybe even photographs. I mean, if something this amazing and strange had happened. So it seemed like something, whether it was Bobby's ghost or something else, had ruined the production of A Christmas Carol on Christmas Day in 1974. I mean, that seemed to be the premise, right? Or did it? So this is sort of where the investigation really kicks into gear, right? Because as an investigator, I'm looking for facts, I'm looking for evidence I can verify, I'm looking for corroborating evidence, I'm looking for what's called triangulation, looking at different angles into it. And the first step to solving this mystery was to verify the date. Now, according to several sources, including Antonio Garces in his book Adobe Angels, and also this is where the Jewel Sanchez quote came from. The doomed production of A Christmas Carol was held on Christmas 1974. So Mike and I are like, well, let's double check this. So as it turns out, in 1974, the Chemo was actually a porn theater. They were showing adult films. So this is I tracked down an ad from Christmas 1974, and what was playing was not a stage production of Charles Dickens, but instead a film titled Teenage Fantasies, with the second feature titled Too Hot to Print, with the obligatory typo there. So there was no Charles Dickens going on at that theater anyway. So I'm like, Dennis, this isn't this authoritative book is saying that it happened in 74. It literally could not have happened in 74. What's going on here? And Dennis is like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, they got the date wrong. It wasn't 74, it was the 80s. He said it was either late 80s or early 90s. And I'm thinking, you don't remember what decade this was? I mean, you watched lights explode and poltergeist activity and crazy once in a lifetime thing, and you don't remember what year it was? I'm like, all right. So eventually we narrowed it down the year to December 1986. And actually, just parenthetically, the way we did that was that some of the children, of course, it's A Christmas Carol, so there were kids in the play. Some of them were late because they had gone to see a Star Trek film. And so we identified the Star Trek film. We narrowed it down to December 86 when that film had come out. So once we'd gotten that, then we can track down other people involved in the performance, right? Including Steve Schwartz, who played Bob Cratchit. So I interviewed Steve Schwartz. Actually, Mike interviewed Schwartz. I interviewed the next guy, the producer, and we said, "Tell us about this thing that happened." And he says, "Yeah, it went great. It was a wonderful performance." I'm like, "But this is like a famous haunted performance. Like lights were exploding and actors were tripping over the lines and things were falling down and there were like." You were being pushed around by ghosts. And he said, quote, "That sounds like good copy, but I can't corroborate any of that. I don't remember any problems like that or any problems with the show." Well, this is one of the main actors on the stage. How is it that he doesn't remember this, but Potter does? So, okay, well, look, I have a degree in psychology. People misremember things. It's common. It's not unusual. Everybody misremembers things sometimes. So just because one person's memory doesn't jive with another person's doesn't mean that someone's necessarily lying or wrong. It just means they're different memories. So let's ask somebody else. So we interviewed Andrew Shea, who directed that performance. And again, he was allegedly the director that took down the donuts, which then angered little Bobby and created the problems. And Shea also disputed Potter's recollection. Quote, "I don't remember it being a disaster in any way," he said. And I said, "Mr. Shea, I mean, this is a famous story going on in Albuquerque. It's published every year on Halloween. You're part of the story. You were there." He's like, "In terms of that day Dennis is talking about, no, I don't remember anything supernatural out of the ordinary at all." So I'm like, well, hold on here, right? I have what's going on here. I'm trying to parse this out. And so the question then becomes, how did the story get so famous? And the simple answer is that Dennis Potter is the source for virtually all the information, and the journalists, writers, investigators repeated the stories without doing any original research. And this happens over and over and over again. It's one of the things that really frustrates me as a folklorist, as a researcher, is I try and bring scholarship to it and researching things and citations, references, and I try to back up what I say. And most of what's out there, particularly in the field of the paranormal and unexplained and ghosts, it's cut and paste stuff. It's if people don't bother to look for original sources, they just pull something off and they say it's true, whatever else. And it's very frustrating for somebody like me who's actually trying to get to the bottom of the story. So there's all sorts of cutting and pasting and copying, and I actually found several cases of outright plagiarism. So I'm thinking, okay, well, Dennis says this happened, and he's the source for basically all the current information. And if you notice his description, it very closely parallels what Joel Sanchez says. And if you go online about the Chemo Theater and the mysterious things go on there, they are using almost verbatim, sometimes it is verbatim, Dennis Potter's quotes. I mean, he is basically the single source for this, and it sort of goes on and on. And so I said, okay, well, we have the guy that played Bob Cratchit doesn't remember this. The director of the play doesn't remember this. What about the audience, right? Because keep in mind, there were presumably audiences there, maybe probably at least the parents of the kids who were there. So there should be dozens, if not hundreds of people who were there. Now, there's no really way to know who was in the audience at the time, but maybe a critic from the local newspaper attended the play. And at the time, there were two local newspapers, the Journal and the Tribune. And we investigated, and there was nothing at all. There were a couple of reviews of the Christmas Carol that year. None of them mentioned exploding lights, actors tripping, ghosts, paranormal, weird things going on. And I contacted Ollie Reed Jr., who's now working at a local bookstore. He's since retired, but he was there at the time. And I asked Ollie, I said, what about this story? He says, I don't recall any stories about any unusual events related to that production. So one reason I love this case, and one reason I like to talk about it in my talks, and I did a book chapter on it, is because it's unusual in several ways. Number one, it's widely known, certainly throughout New Mexico. Every Halloween it comes up again. It's been on TV shows, it's been blogs, whatever else. And ultimately, it's not a lie or a hoax. This is one thing. This is one thing I find fascinating about it. So it's not a lie or a hoax, but nor is it true. And it's basically a collection of myths and mistaken memories and misunderstandings. So I met Dennis. He's a nice guy. We hung out. I have no reason to think he's lying. He's not doing it for attention. I think he's genuinely and sincerely believes that it happened. He's become sort of the guy that told this story and is sort of the keeper of the chemo story. And so I don't think he manufactured it. I don't think he's a liar. I don't think he's a hoaxer. I think he simply misremembered a collection of unusual things, and he misremembers them all happening on the same night. And I'm leaving out some details in the case. Again, I did a whole chapter on this, so if you want to know more about it, you can find that. I was also on a TV show with Larry Barker, who's here in Albuquerque. He's sort of a well-known investigative journalist. And there's me actually in the Chemo Theater with this cameraman, friend of mine, Mark Corey. And Larry was asking me to explain why it is that the ghost hunters would go and find evidence of ghosts, particularly Bobby Darnell, in the Chemo Theater, if in fact there's no truth to what happened. And he said, well, there's a TV clip of a ghost hunter using an EMF detector and finding beeps. And so if you look in that photograph right there, in my right hand, there's an EMF detector, and it's lit up. And he said, well, the ghost hunters claim that these detect electromagnetic fields and it's beeping. So what are they detecting? And I said, well, let me show you. So I pulled one out. And in fact, I explained, and this is actually what's depicted in this photograph, is that there's actually electrical currents in the ground because there are electrical outlets around some of the chairs there, in case people need a laptop or whatever else. And so what the ghost hunters who went to the Chemo Theater were detecting wasn't the presence of a ghost; it was an electrical outlet that they didn't notice was there, and that was what was creating the ghosty thing. So I also did a bunch of other investigations, including the Santa Fe courthouse ghost, but I am out of time, and so I'm going to leave a bit of time for Q&A. So I will turn things over to Sandra and see where it goes from there. So thank you for listening, if indeed you were listening, at least not.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. We could go on longer. It was so interesting. But we will leave time for Q&A. If anybody has any questions, please unmute your microphones and just ask a question to Ben. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. And Thank you, Ben, for sharing Investigating Ghosts, which is the winner of the New Mexico Arizona Book Award. Ben's books can be bought at Amazon.com. We can also check out some of his titles at the Corrales Community Library. I know a couple of them are checked out right now. His Mysterious New Mexico, Miracles, Magic, and Monsters in the Land of Enchantment is checked out. We have Bad Clowns, Lake Monster Mysteries, and of course, Tracking the Chupacabra available at the Corrales Community Library. Any questions from the audience?
Sure.
I explained it just too well. Oh, okay, Chris, go for it.
First, thanks, Ben. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
First, I'd like to know if there was like one defining moment that got you interested in this area, kind of what stimulated your interest. And then the second one is one of the first stories we heard when we moved down here to New Mexico was La Llorona. Yep. And in fact, heard it at the ghost stories that the library put on when our daughter was real little. And I just never really knew anything about the background of that story, just heard it, scared the hell out of me. And so if you have anything on that.
I do, yes. Thank you for the question. I'll start with the second question first. So La Llorona is actually one of the chapters in my book, Mysterious New Mexico. In fact, the cover image is of La Llorona. And this book was actually banned from a Santa Fe bookstore because the woman that ran the bookstore hated this cover so much, it creeped her out so much, she refuses to carry my book. So yeah, anyway, I have a whole chapter on La Llorona. It's a fascinating story. I'll give you a little tidbit, but again, there's a whole chapter on it there. So basically, yeah, I mean, La Llorona, of course, it's known as the weeping woman in Hispanic folklore, although it actually goes back to, they actually traces back among folklorists who, again, this is so many of these things, particularly ghost lore, it's folklore. And people forget there's a whole field of study about rumors and legends, and it's cool and it's fascinating. I love it. And it's called folklore. And people don't make that connection. They think, well, here's this weird thing. Like, yes, people have been studying legends about that weird thing. There's journals about it. There's books about it. I have friends who do this. There's a whole field that a lot of people sort of forget this out there. A little shout out to folklorists. But yeah, there's so actually folklorists traced La Llorona back to a German legend that has similar aspects to it. In a nutshell, the story of La Llorona is that people claim to often hear La Llorona. And the story is that you'll see here around bodies of water, so ditches, streams, rivers. Of course, the Rio Grande is not too far away from the Corrales Library and Corrales where I grew up. And the story is that on moonless nights or full moon nights, take your pick, it's legends, you can hear whistling in the wind. You can hear this woman calling for her children. And the idea is that, again, I don't have time to go into it. Basically, the story is that she drowned her children to be with a man, and that she later, the guilt drove her crazy. And to this day, she's goes back and forth along ditches. And when I was in elementary school, I was told to watch out for La Llorona and to stay away from the ditches. Ditches are deadly, stay away. And they used the image of La Llorona. So even to us kids, even us Caucasian kids, like, whoa, there's something scary around the ditch. And so La Llorona is a fascinating example of using boogeymen and boogie women to pass along, lessons about what we should do. And on my podcast, Squaring the Strange, we've done a couple episodes on sort of the boogeymen and boogie women role of folklore and fairy tales in that. So anyway, in terms of your first question, I got interested in a nutshell. I got interested in investigation as a teenager when I grew up in Corrales. And I would go to, at the time, there was a used bookstore across from the elementary school. Long gone, there was a farmer's place there for some old time Corraleños will remember that. And I would get my allowance of, $5 for, cleaning out the cat box and whatever else. And I would go to the local bookstore and I'd plunk down $5 and I'd come home with these armloads full of books. And of course, I still love books and right around there. And for several summers as a teenager, I was just voracious reader. And I don't have as much time these days, unfortunately, but at the time, so I was going through these books and all these books, and I just buy the, UFOs and monsters and cryptozoology and ghosts and, urban legends and just weird things and psychics and Bermuda Triangle. And I would read these books and I was fascinated by them. And I'm like, oh my God, this is crazy. This is wild. But I gradually got disillusioned because I recognized that that most of the books I was reading weren't written by investigators. In most of the books I was reading about mysterious phenomena, the author had not done any actual research. It was just like, it is said that, and they say that, and which is all well and good. That's folklore, but that's not investigation. And over and over again, I would pick up a book on psychics. I'd pick up a book on the Loch Ness Monster. I'd pick a book on Bermuda Triangle. And it was all this very like, oh my God, this is crazy. This is wild. I'm like, well, how do you know? I mean, I'm not saying, I'd be talking to the author through their book. I'd say, I bought your book secondhand, but I bought your book and I'm reading your book and you want me to believe what you're telling me in your book. Where did you get it? What research did you do? And so oftentimes there were no references at all. And so I said, well, hold on here. It's like, I don't, it was my early skepticism was like, I just because it's in print doesn't mean it's true. And just of course, now that's just because it's online doesn't mean it's true. So I began to get disillusioned with the lack of actual investigation and research in these books. There was like no scholarship. There was very few references. It was just sort of like, they say stories and people misquoting and no original research. And I said, well, hold on here. These are fascinating topics, right? These are these are if ghosts exist, if Bigfoot exists, if chupacabras exist, this is important. This is interesting. This is relevant. This is real, right? If psychics exist and can predict the future, this would be good to know, especially before 9/11. Right? If psychic detectives can find missing persons, this is important to know that we should use them to find missing people, find Brian Laundrie, find all these missing persons. And yet, so there was this disjoint between what was claimed and the real world. And that was what sort of launched me into this. And I said, okay, well, if they're not going to do the research, then I will. Right? I mean, I ended up going to the University of New Mexico. I got a degree in psychology, and then I went in to get a master's in education. But that was sort of what intrigued me is basically like, well, if they're not going to do the research, if they're not going to put in the time and the effort to try and solve these things, well, then I will, because I think these things are cool. And whether ghosts exist or not, whether Bigfoot exists or not, psychics, they're fascinating either way. And so my question is just, what is the evidence for it? So that's sort of a rambling answer to your question.
No, I appreciate that. Thanks, Ben.
I see Greg Kelly has a hand up.
Yes.
Hi, Ben. So talk about ostensive action. Did you see the story of 4 or 5 days ago that a woman was shot in Mexico dressed up as La Llorona, and she was scaring? So this was, what was the day? That. The story I've got, let's see, it was October 22nd, but I don't know, it was a day or two old at that point. But basically, she was dressing up as La Llorona, scaring people in the town, and then she was shot and killed.
Wow.
But it's ostensive action, like,
sure.
Like, you talk about a lot. I talk about that. So I wanted to ask you, so you mentioned that one of the sort of 19th century kind of tropes of, poltergeist, or the rattling chains, of course that shows up in A Christmas Carol. This
right.
kind of loops back around to the theater, right? But was that like a conventional motif that Dickens picked up, or may it have originated with him? Marley's ghost with the chains and the...
Oh yeah, that's a good question.
Because that's pretty early. Like
yeah.
Christmas Carol, when was that? Is it 40s?
Yeah, I think it was around there. I think it was just before like the Pickwick Papers and stuff. Yeah, that's a great question. For those who don't know, Greg Kelly is a folklorist, so I'm sort of every time I talk in front of folklore, it's like, Argh! But But no, it's my understanding is that I think Dickens used that in much in the way, for example, Dickens used spontaneous human combustion in the Pickwick Papers, where he actually got into an argument. We did a show on this on the Square and the Strange a while back, where somebody had challenged Dickens and said, well, people just can't explode. Dickens says, yes, they can. And he was quoting some tabloid journalism from 1830s as being evidence of that. So Dickens, I'm far from a Dickens scholar, but my understanding is that Dickens often, he used contemporaneous stuff, and sort of because it was number one, it was creepy and scary and very Dickensian, but it fit the motifs. So
there may have been, who knows? There may have been Elizabethan like prototypes for that, or like in Hamlet, they may have staged it with some clanking like that registered with Dickens, who was quite an avid reader of Shakespeare, I understand. I don't know. I was wondering because you mentioned it, and I was going, "Oh yeah, that's Dickens."
No, that's a great question. I do know that throughout. I talked earlier about how so many ideas about ghosts are culture bound and culture specific, and I do know that one belief was that the candle flames burned blue in the presence of ghosts. Now these days, it's sort of archaic. Modern ghost hunters, if you watch any of the modern TV shows, you don't have ghost hunters like lighting candles to see if the candle turns blue. But again, this is a widely held belief, for a long time. So and that's one of the interesting aspects of ghosts, particularly, is because they are liminal, right? They're ambiguous. Was there a ghost here? Who knows, right? Did you feel something weird? Yes, but anything can be weird. So
as you know, we've talked about this before. We both like historical stuff, and it's so I like that idea. Like in Hamlet, there's you get an idea of what the Elizabethan audience you're distracting me. What the Elizabethan audience would think about ghosts, because of course, when Hamlet's talking to his father's ghost, and the ghost says, well, I could tell you more, but I can't now because the rooster is about to crow. So there's something about daylight that the ghosts are not, that they have to leave, right? But that must have been part of the lore for that to be incorporated at that early point. So anyway, thanks again for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I don't want to tell you that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Anybody else? Questions, comments, criticisms?
Ben, I have a question.
Yes.
Thank you for your talk. I've heard you speak many times in your books, always very interesting and informative.
Thank you.
My question is, with all of your investigations into paranormal and urban legends and so forth, have you ever come across anything that you thought had credibility or could have been true, or that you couldn't disprove?
Okay, so there's two answers to this. Number one, that's a common question. It's a perfectly understandable question, right? Because okay, Mr. Investigator, you've read all these books, So I'll give you two quick anecdotes. The first one is, I'll give you an example of something that I'm pretty sure was true in a way. So I as I think was mentioned earlier, I wrote a book on lake monsters titled Lake Monster Mysteries with Joe Nickel, a colleague of mine. And in that book, we cover a lot of lake monsters, including Ogopogo and Champ and so on. But there's one particular lake monster I investigated in Newfoundland. And that was, it's a creature called Cressy in Crescent Lake, which is sort of northern Newfoundland. And I was there investigating. I was actually investigating ghost stories and giant squid, because giant squid wash up on Newfoundland. Anyway, so I was there, and I was like, well, as long as I'm here, I'm going to investigate lake monsters, because that's what I do. So I did some research into it, and it turned out that the creature in Lake Crescent called Cressy is distinctive. Now, I'm not going to go into a whole talk on lake monsters, but typically there's a couple typical classic characteristics. One of them, of course, is the hump in the neck. There's different versions of it, different colors and textures reported. In this particular case, it was reported as being specifically sort of laying flat along the water and dark, sort of a slimy or shiny coat or skin. And so I'm researching it, and I'm looking up, and it's not a well-known lake monster outside of Canada, but it's certainly the best known in Newfoundland. And Crescent Lake, it's a small lake. I mean, you could walk around it in 40 minutes. And so I was interviewing people there. I was like, tell me about Cressy. And in fact, there's actually a sculpture of Cressy as you enter this town. It's this little, that's like a metal and paper mache thing. It's actually kind of cool. Anyway, so I was asking them, it's like, okay, so I said, so I was looking at the descriptions of your lake monster Cressy, and it seems like they tracks along sort of like with eels. I mean, it's dark and eel-like. I said, are there eels in the lake? He's like, oh yeah, big ones, big eels. I'm like, okay, well, is it possible that Cressy is one or more eels? He's like, oh yeah, that could be. I'm like, okay, well, I think I saw this one. I mean, I don't know, but I mean, it's like, well, you find eels there, and eels look a lot like. He's like, yeah. And so he was very matter of fact about it. It's sort of a touristy thing. So in that case, I'm like, well, do I think there's a lake? Do I think there's an actual lake monster in Crescent Lake in Newfoundland? No. Do I think there are big ass eels that could easily be mistaken for a lake monster? Absolutely, they've been caught there. So that's an example. So I would say that in terms of things that I think there may be some truth to it. I would say probably intuition, but from a psychological point of view, sort of, and basically because people can know things without knowing how they know them. Just sort of, just again, going to psychology, basically you can pick up cues from your environment and not. So if you ask somebody, how do you know that? Like, I just kind of know it. And it's not like facts, dates, like, when there was the War of 1812, but just like cues your environment. So because the in your brain, the place where information is stored is different than the place where you got that source of information. And so you might not connect the two. So you might know a fact, you don't know where you got that fact. And this is a problem for media literacy, right? Because the source of information, any information, its credibility is tied to where you got that information. Did you hear it on the bus? Did you hear it from Einstein? I mean, where did you get this information? And because they're often not connected in our brains, it's hard to do that. So in a nutshell, I suspect there may be something to intuition. And again, I don't mean that in a sort of ESP sense, but in a way that people can sometimes know things without knowing how they know them. And so I think there may be some truth to that.
Thank you.
Okay, Sandra, are we out of time? We want to take one more? It's up to you. You're running the show.
If we have another question, we'll take it. This has been fascinating, and I'm enjoying hearing your responses to these questions. So we do have time if anybody has one more question, and then we'll call it a night.
Okay.
Jasmine, go ahead.
Have you heard about a ghost at the Fetchen house in Taos? About the old owner?
No, I don't think I have.
Okay, because I had an experience and I wanted to share it.
Okay.
Because this was like 15 years ago, and I just wondered if you had heard about it. Because I was going to the Fetchen house with a girlfriend of mine 15 years ago. And we went there early in the morning when it opened at 10 o'clock in the morning. And we went in, and then we walked around downstairs, and then we heard some footsteps upstairs. And when we came out, we were talking to the lady, and we said, well, if anybody had been in there, because we heard some footsteps. She said, nobody has been in the gallery. We just opened the house this morning at 10 o'clock. And we both heard somebody walk up there. And she said that had happened before, that there was, they thought there was a ghost, that was a man that lived there before Fitchin or whoever it was. And I just wanted to know if you had heard about this. Was like 15 years ago, and I think they're closed the house. But that was one thing that I witnessed it because I heard it and my girlfriend heard it. And she said, nobody has been in here. We just opened.
Right.
So how do you explain
Yeah,
that one?
I haven't investigated that particular one. I've investigated, the La Fonda, the St. James. There's one of the things about ghosts is that it takes very, very little to create a ghost story. The Chemo Theater is a unusual example just because it's so prominent and so there's so many aspects to it. But most ghost stories are very, again, it's all you need is somebody saying they something weird or whatever else, and so it's hard. It's actually harder to find a place that doesn't have a ghost in a town or something, right? They're just everywhere. But I haven't heard that particular story, although I'd be curious to next time.
How do you explain that one?
Well, I would need to have more information. Certainly one thing that jumps out at me is that I talk about this in my book, Investigating Ghosts, is that sometimes what sounds like one thing can actually be something else. So, for example, I've been on investigations with ghost hunters, and they will say, "Did you hear those footsteps?" And they say, "Yeah, I heard the footsteps." And we'd actually go investigate, and it wasn't a footstep at all. Sometimes it was a branch on just sort of hitting on a certain pattern because of the wind, whatever else. But so in other words, it's possible. And again, I don't know, I wasn't there, but it's possible that what sounded like footsteps was not in fact footsteps. It could have been something else.
So you don't believe in it?
No, I didn't say that at all. No, seriously, I didn't say that. What I said was that, no, it's an important distinction because as an investigator,
yeah,
it's I'll give you one quick example. So I mentioned I was at Fort George in Ontario, and I had a ghost hunter come up to me, and she said, "Hey, will you listen to this EVP I have of this ghost?" And so, what do you have? It's like, well, I recorded this yesterday, and I was in this part of the fort, and I recorded a girl ghost. And I said, I will listen to your evidence. I will listen to the open mind. But first, tell me, how do you know it's a girl ghost? He said, "What do you mean?" I said, I don't know what a girl ghost sounds like. I mean, I genuinely don't. I'm not being facetious. I don't know what a girl ghost sounds like. I know what a human child sounds like. I don't know for sure what a ghost sounds like. I certainly don't know what a ghost child sounds like. And when I framed it that way, she sort of recognized what I was going at, which was that I wasn't saying that her evidence wasn't evidence. I wasn't saying she hadn't recorded a child ghost. I was asking her to question her assumptions and to say, okay, I'm not saying it's not it. I'm asking, why are you so sure that is it? And she said, well, because it sounds like a girl. And I said, well, it could be a girl. I mean, I don't know, but you have to question your assumptions if you're going to offer them as evidence. So anyway, that's a great story, though. Maybe I'll dig into it.
I think that's what makes Ben's work such a high caliber and quality work, is that he puts such a tremendous amount of research into everything that he writes and investigates, and looks into it before presuming anything. And that being said, we are out of time. I want to thank you again, Ben. It was a wonderful evening, and thank you all for joining us tonight. And please join us next month for our author series with local author Carol Merrill as we talk about her books on Georgia O'Keeffe. And for more information, please visit Ben's website, benjaminradford.com. There's links to his podcast. There's a lot of links there with fascinating information. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks for coming. Ciao.